There are other schools that should be interested in joining the Big 12 as well. There's a lot of different options. Who could those options be?
You are Locked On Wildcats, your daily podcast on the Arizona Wildcats. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, I'm your host, Mike Luke. This show is brought to you by FanDuel. Check it out. All kinds of good stuff. FanDuel makes the betting experience more enjoyable. Check it out. FanDuel.com. All right. Now, I'm your host, Mike Luke from Locked On Wildcats. All right. Now, with the Big 12, obviously everybody knows Brett Yormark's plan. He wants to be able to add Clemson and he wants to be able to add Florida State. Those would obviously be massive, massive additions for the Big 12. And there's a variety of reasons why. First and foremost is if that were to happen, you would also know that the Big 12 would be an entity that would have to be at the forefront of basically any negotiations, anything you name. The Big 12 would be a big problem at that point. I'm not really breaking any news to you on that. There would essentially be three major conferences at that point. There would be the Big 12, there would be the ACC, there would be the Big 12, the Big 10, and the SEC. Would be those three schools or those three conferences. Then basically, it goes from there. But it's basically impossible to box out the Big 12 at that point if that were to happen. Now, there's a lot of different avenues here that something could happen for the Big 12 as far as just adding some new schools, adding a variety of different options. We're going to talk about that today. And so the first thing is Brett Yormark, I think, knows that if the ACC were to collapse, there's going to be more inventory out there. And I think that he's going to be encouraged to add more teams. And if that is the case, then he definitely knows where he's going to add those teams. But besides Florida State and besides Clemson, there are obviously some other ones. We've talked a great deal about some of the other two. Miami and Louisville are definitely the other two that are on that wish list. Miami, you could just tell with Miami, it's because they have a marquee football brand. And even though they haven't been great of late, Miami football sells. Everybody knows what Miami football, it's a known brand. You know that, you know what you see when you get it. Then Louisville has underrated football, a dynamic fan base, and I think more so than anything, and where this might be the biggest part of all of this is a basketball where it fits in really well. And a lot of money and a fan base that really, really cares. That is a big part in all of this. You look around the landscape of the Big 12, these are fan bases that care. These are not the Pac-12 days where you could go into Haas Pavilion and basically walk up at the last second and say, hey, I'd like a seat. And you can walk in and sit right behind the coach. That was essentially the Pac-12 in its last days. Stanford the same way. There was a bunch of different schools like that, but not impressive stuff. And, it was just a lot different from when I grew up that, like if you went into Maples Pavilion, you knew that was going to be, besides McHale, that was going to be the most raucous environment on the entire West Coast. Mike Montgomery had it going, and you went in there, was about 8,000 people, and they were crazy. There were a lot of great games there. Those days are no longer, they no longer exist. Those kind of games are in the Big 12, and I think the Big 12 probably has the best fan base in the country, so we are going to talk about some of these schools. Obviously, Louisville, Miami, they would be part of that wish list top four, but there's other schools that I think make a lot of sense as well. Some I don't know that I would add, but we're going to talk about a smorgasbord of possibilities here. Now, the first one, North Carolina State. North Carolina State's interesting. Solid football. Obviously, it makes you a coast-to-coast conference at that point. I know that you have UCF in the Big 12, but we're talking about really expanding out into the Alleghenies. And adding North Carolina State would be good. Listen, you made a Final Four just recently. You got a probably 25, top 30 football program. Now, again, those things are fluid. But overall, North Carolina State, good athletics, good fan base, and I think it would be a natural fit. Also, I don't think that when you look around I don't see the ACC or the SEC being interested in North Carolina State. I just don't think that's going to be the case, and I also don't see the Big Ten being interested in North Carolina State, which makes it a nice little fit into the Big 12. Plus, I think it would up its basketball game a big deal. North Carolina State, I've always felt, has good basketball potential. We've seen that. Obviously, you won a national championship in the past, in the 80s, but you've also seen too that they can have success as well. And then football-wise, it's a pretty good football program. It's an underrated football program, so there's a lot to like about North Carolina State. Plus, as we've talked about, Brett Yormark wants to make this a coastal conference from coast to coast, which is going to get us into some of those other schools in a second. But you already got the Southwest. You've already got the Heartland. You're starting to get into the Southeast when it comes to, UCF. What can you get then? Obviously a Florida State and a Clemson would change all that. But North Carolina State, I think, brings a very, very interesting item to the table as well. So that's a school to certainly keep in mind. Now, Virginia Tech is another one. Virginia Tech's fascinating because under Frank Beamer, it was probably one of the top 15 football programs or entities in the country. All kind, you look at your Kevin Jones, your Lee Suggs, your Michael Vicks. I mean, heck, even your Marcus Vicks. After that, there was a lot of really, really good players that came through Virginia Tech, and I don't know why that can't be the case again. It would also get you kind of up into that northeastern area, which would factor right into what Brett Yormark wants to do as far as, like I said, making it a national entity. I think the thing with Virginia Tech, I don't necessarily know what they're really hanging their hat on though. And because again, it's not like it's a great basketball program. Probably never will be a great basketball program. I realize that football is the bigger revenue supporter, but at the same time, I don't know. Whereas North Carolina State, I believe, has a higher upside in both football and basketball than Virginia Tech, even if Virginia Tech might have a little bit better of a legacy. North Carolina State to me is more appealing, but Virginia Tech, though, is no slouch. Also, listen, when we talk about all these overrated Big Ten teams, Virginia Tech is far better than these teams for a bunch of different reasons. Virginia Tech, I will take over Rutgers. No, thanks. I will take Virginia Tech over Maryland right now. Yes. I will take, and I can keep going on and on down the list, but overall there's some potential, but North Carolina State would be the one that I would really pay some attention to. And then after that, we start looking at Virginia Tech. And then I think if you want to really go up the West Coast, if you really want to talk about some Northwest schools that I think have some real potential to be intriguing, then you got to start talking about two of the schools that we're going to mention. But first, FanDuel. Check it out, FanDuel.com. Here's the deal. I do not like baseball. I have no interest in baseball whatsoever. But guess what? I do have interest in baseball if my hard-earned cash is going towards what I'm watching. Check it out, FanDuel.com. This is one of those things, too. You know that it is good. You know that if you bet money, you will, if you put your money down, you will get your investment back. There's not going to be any one of these things where you get called into a third party and you get stuck with some guy in Sri Lanka. You get the deal. You get your money immediately. Check it out, FanDuel.com. Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats and making this your first listen of the day. I am your host, Mike Luke. All right, now let's talk about some of the other schools. Now, again, we are just spitballing on this show. We are not getting into all kinds of specifics, but we're just spitballing some other schools that, some names have been bandied about as to, schools that could be an interesting fit in the Big 12. Now, the next two that I want to talk about are Oregon State and Washington State. Now, you might say, Mike, they already had a chance to join and the Big 12 didn't want them. Correct. Because that's the other four brands that they wanted were bigger brands. But at the same time, Oregon State and Washington State, I think, do bring a little bit of appeal. First, geographically, it makes sense. If you want to make it a national conference, you bring those two in. Also, it's been kind of underrated football. Listen, at the University of Arizona, we've had 2 seasons where we finished in the top 25 since the turn of the century. At Oregon State, I believe they've had 6. Washington State might maybe even more. Either way, they've definitely have been better football entities. And with Oregon State, you've got a rabid fan base. You've got a fan base that very much likes their sports. It's got very much of a college type feel to it because, again, in Corvallis, that's what matters to them is their Beavers. And, like I said, you look at it, they've had a pretty good they've had a pretty good run over the years. Dennis Erickson led them to a top 5 finish, back in 2000. Then Mike Riley had a number of top 25 teams. Jonathan Smith did a really good job before moving on to Michigan State. So there is that. And again, it's kind of a pesky fan base. Basketball, they got to figure out something about because obviously Wayne Tinkle, no good. Boo, 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 Wayne Tinkle. We do not like Wayne Tinkle. But overall, there's a lot to like about the possibility of Oregon State. So, again, I don't know that one's going to happen, but it's a name that has been thrown out there a few times, so we figured that we should definitely mention it. And, again, the Beaver fan base has definitely grown on me. All right, now, the next one, Washington State, much the same. Now, I will say this. I haven't come across nearly the amount of Washington State fans that I have Oregon State fans. I don't know if that's just me not noticing or whatever, but either way, Washington State also fascinating. You're up in the Northwest, obviously, but football-wise, you've had some really good success over the years. You've had some players come out of there. You've had programs. I mean, we talk about Mike Price and what he did. He was a guy that got the Alabama job. And so, I mean, you could do that. And then after that, his successor had a really good year. You had a couple, I think you had 1.3 top 10 finishes in a 10-year period. Mike Leach obviously did wonders at Washington State as well. So there is and if you look at their track record, it's solid and it probably factors in with about anybody out there, as far as some of these schools we're talking about. Now, I think the question with both of these schools, though, is, nationally, what do they really bring? What do they really bring to you? And that's something that I don't really know the answer to. I think it's a fair question, but I do think that there is some potential for those schools. They're, like I said, I get if you don't add them, but I also think that you would be bringing in 2 fan bases, especially Oregon State, that would fit in very, very well in the grand scheme of things in the Big 12, because, again, these are passionate fan bases that really care about sports. Now, some of the other names, I get people all the time that ask me, they're like, well, what about Duke or North Carolina? No, dead on arrival, will not happen. Duke is much more of a Big Ten type fit, mainly because, well, first of all, culturally, it's more of a Big Ten fit. And second of all, academically, it is a school that is, Duke is a pretty elite academic institution. You're probably not going to be looking to get into the Big 12 with the kind of academics that Duke has. North Carolina's much in the same boat. They both feel like Big Ten. They both feel like Big Ten naturals. And honestly, if you're North Carolina or you're a Duke and you're looking and you're like, man, we can get a raise to go to the Big Ten and beat up on all those crappy basketball teams. I think you're going to be interested in that. So those both make a lot more sense to me than going into the SEC. The SEC as well. Those don't make a ton of sense. Then, like we talked about with Florida State, Florida State might just not have a lot of options. It's obviously a premier football brand. It's a top 10 football brand in the country, but you don't have, it's not an AAU accredited school. So academically, it's not going to be something that's going to fit in well in the Big Ten. You also have the reputation for being a little bit of a squeaky wheel. I don't think the Big Ten really wants to deal with any of that. So Florida State might not have a lot of options. And the SEC doesn't take them. And I get why the SEC wouldn't, because if you're the SEC, you're also not really looking to throw a lifeline to a team or an entity that, could take away one of your automatic bids. I don't think that you want that. And I don't really blame them as well. So if they get out of that, then I think the next question is, where can you end up? Because at this point, the ACC would be blown up. And, sometimes you just got to go to the person that's still going to leave the light on for you And the Big 12 would be that. Keep in mind, Arizona State and their dweeb president, Michael Crow, wanted nothing to do with going to ASU or going to the Big 12, and neither did Utah. But guess what? When the Pac-12 folded, Big 12 was right there. Sometimes beggars can't be choosers. Also, Brett Yormark has talked a ton about the possibilities of private equity and all of this. You get private equity involved, and you can start paying some schools a little bit more than maybe their TV deal was. I think that Yormark is somebody that could definitely make that one happen as well. So just because so if you see somebody and they're a Florida State fan, or they're an ACC fan, or they're a Clemson fan, and they go, we would never go to the Big 12. Well, you know what? ASU said that too. Sometimes you got to go where you're actually wanted. Listen, if you have to have a date to the prom and there's only one person that'll go, and to get in, you have to take that one person. Guess what? You got to take that one person. And I think that's where those schools are going to end up. It's going to be, like I said, certainly not a foregone conclusion, but going to be interesting. Now, when it comes to Miami, Miami might have a few more options because, again, Miami is AAU accredited. It doesn't have great facilities, that's for sure. But also, I could see the SEC being a little bit more interested in him. Plus, Miami doesn't have kind of the crummy reputation, I guess, that Florida State does. So Miami might be an option. Louisville, not an option probably for either one. First of all, not an AAU accredited school, when likely never will be. And in the SEC, I don't think they want them as well. So with Louisville, I would imagine Louisville is definitely one that would run to the Big 12, and I think that they would be a natural fit in the Big 12. That one to me has made all the sense in the world. Louisville, saddle up, partner. I look at their fan base and they remind me a lot of Arizona. I think they want to get here, and I say bring them in. All right, now we're going to talk about the basketball only aspect to this in the last segment, but got to pay the bills. Gametime, my friends. Gametime. Check it out. Download the Gametime app today. Use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. All kinds of great things at Gametime. Another one of these things where you will thank me later. You can go to a bad rock concert, or you can go to a great basketball game. Either way, Gametime has you covered. They will make sure that you get what you need. Check it out. Again, download the Gametime app. Use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Again, $20 off, my friends. Very, very enticing. Check it out, Gametime. One, you will thank me later. And the other one, the elephant in the room, eBay Motors. All right, let's say that you got some bad stuff going on with your vehicle, and you're like, man, I gotta get this taken care of, but I also know that I'm going to be screwed out of this stuff by the guy at the corner shop. eBay Motors says, no. Come to us and and then take it to somebody you trust, so you can get the parts that you want, and you can take it to somebody you trust. It is really that simple. Millions of parts for your MVP. Win every time with parts that fit your ride. Again, don't get screwed by the middleman. eBay Motors says, we are the middleman. We will help you. So there again, check it out. And then take it to somebody you trust. Again, you will thank me later. Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats and making this your first listen of the day. I am your host, Mike Luke. All right, now let's talk a little bit. Let's strategize a little bit about the basketball only aspect. I believe, and I do not care what anybody else says, I believe that basketball is an underrated. I just believe it's an underrated entity, period, when it comes to financials. And there's a couple different reasons. First is that, listen, basketball owns March. When you completely own a month, that is going to be something that you've got to take into serious account. Second of all, that inventory, that primetime inventory from January, February, March, and even late December is all college basketball. That's a big thing. You can't just replace that with reruns of American Gladiators or something like that, or something I grew up watching. I mean, that's not, we're not in those days anymore. So you've got to fill it with good inventory, and you obviously have that with college basketball. Now, Brett Yormark has made a point to anybody that will listen, and he's right, that the Big 12 is the best basketball conference in the country. Duh. And it is. But if you could add a Gonzaga or a UConn, you can really put a stranglehold on it. I mean, let's talk UConn for a second. I get that if UConn were to join, you're probably looking at them as being a basketball-only school at that point. Or if they were to join and obviously with basketball, then you would probably have maybe their football goes independent. I don't know. Who cares? It's UConn football. But with the UConn basketball, though, you won 6 national championships in the last 25 years. That speaks for itself. It's been the premier basketball institution in the entire country, and they don't appear to be going anywhere under Danny Hurley. So you bring them in, and then all of a sudden you've got such a stranglehold on college basketball that I think it becomes impossible to shut the Big 12 out either way at the negotiation table. Yes, I get that football is king. I get all of that. Don't care. Because if I've got the best basketball conference in the country by a mile, I'm going to have something to say about that because I know for a fact that I'm going to have a big say come March and on those other months we discussed. UConn is very fascinating in all this, and I think if Brett Yormark had his way, he would definitely add UConn. We will see, though. I do not know how that one will play out, but that's definitely one to keep an eye on. Gonzaga is in much the same boat. Now, again, you don't have to worry about Gonzaga football taking off because Gonzaga football isn't a thing. But you add that, you're also adding into the Northwest. Now, granted, it's in a different aspect than, say, an Oregon State or a Washington State would be. But overall, I think you would have to feel pretty good about Gonzaga adding them to the conference that you have. But so there's a lot of different options that Brett Yormark can traverse here. And, as we've seen with him, a lot of people kind of sit back and, especially the Pac-12, they kind of took this beta approach to everything where, let's let other people figure things out and then we'll try to make our own way when we can. Hopefully we don't offend anybody and hopefully they know how cool we are. Whereas Brett Yormark just makes things happen. And the Big 12 is, I think, the next you watch him and you're like, all right, you got a pretty good sense that this guy's going to make something happen. So if you get Florida State or Clemson or Miami, along with a Louisville, and you add a few other schools, then Brett Yormark's got to be saying game on at that point. So we'll see what happens. But wanted to run through some of the other schools that I think probably should keep a little bit of an eye on. And those were definitely those schools. Now, coming up tomorrow, we are going to talk about the mistakes of the Pac-12. There were many mistakes that were made, and we're going to talk about them, and we're going to make fun of the Pac-12 and see what some of the resemblances are to the ACC and what's going on now. Now, listen, it's a totally different situation, but you still got Brett Yormark creeping around the corner with those, little fingers. So we'll see about that. But there's a lot of things that you can glean from that. A lot of things that I think with the Pac-12, you look at and you're like, all right, well, that was a big mistake. So we're going to talk a ton about that. And then later on in the week, we're going to get back into some U of A football, some U of A basketball. Obviously, practice is right around the corner. Very excited about all of that. And we're going to continue to talk about a smorgasbord of things. But on that note, though, very, very much appreciate you all making Locked On Wildcats your first listen of the day. I'm your host, Mike Luke. Bear down, back the A, and we will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day. TTFN.